Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Fuhse from Humboldt University of Berlin. Today, I want to talk about the digital humanities and computational social science. And the idea, of course, is that they have something to do with networks and culture as the theme of our session. My argument is that digital humanities and computational social science study identities, social relations, and culture in a particular way. This changes how we think about these concepts, or rather, it should change the way we think about them. The argument starts from the assumption that our concepts in the social sciences do not denote fixed essences or substances. Rather, they point to things that we can observe and tell us how to observe them and relate them to each other. If our methods reveal different aspects of the social world, we need concepts to come to terms with these new aspects, rather than concepts that refer to something supposedly out there, but which we cannot see. So the question is, what do we see with the methods of computational social science and digital humanities? We see identities, we see social relations, and we see culture. All of these are old, familiar concepts, but we see new versions of them. So this is the structure of my talk. First, I want to talk about what I mean by digital humanities and computational social science. And then I'm going to talk about identities, social relations, and culture in turn. And I illustrate my arguments with some empirical analyses taken from a paper that has been recently published in Poetics, together with Oskar Stuhler, Jan Riebling, and John Levy-Martin. The paper and the analysis are based on quantitative text analyses of the parliamentary proceedings in the Weimar Republic in Germany from 1918 to 1933. This was our first period of multi-party democracy in Germany between the end of the World War I and the rise of the Nazi regime. So what do I mean by digital humanities and computational social science? The terms cover here specific data and ways of processing. Generally, computational social science and digital humanities deal with large-scale archival data. The data does not come from survey interviews, but from archives, like our parliamentary proceedings. They can also be taken from the internet, for example, by scraping Twitter tweets. The data is generated in the process of communication, and it is often time-stamped. This allows us to investigate communication over time, rather than only cross-sectionally. The data is non-reactive. It comes from naturally occurring communication, at least most often it does. So it is not generated in an artificial interview situation, the sole purpose of which is to generate interview data. Therefore, the data in computational social science is generally not designed with regard to the research question. Rather, we have to fit the research question to the data that we have. And the basic units are documents, not individuals, as for example in survey research. And this comes with far-reaching consequences. So here is an example of what such data looks like. This is a short excerpt from our parliamentary proceedings in the Weimar Republic. It comes from December 1932, when democracy was quickly going downhill in Germany. What you see is a list of names with short or long pieces of text next to them. These pieces of text could be speeches, but they can also be questions, reactions, or procedural orders from the presiding officer. Also, we have notations for what is going on in the auditorium. Here, the stenographers noted Heiterkeit, or hilarity in English. We know that some of the audience laughed, but we don't know who exactly laughed or why. So this is the kind of text that we have to work with, and it opens up distinct ways of studying identities, social relations, and culture. First, to identities. Conventionally, we work with the classical concept of an actor deriving from Max Weber. We learn in surveys or in qualitative interviews about the attributes and the attitudes of the actor. Action then takes place based on this subjective meaning that the actor associates with her situation, and this action then leads to discernible consequences. In contrast, in computational social science and digital humanities, we have actors as points of attribution. The focus lies on observable behavior, on the reactions of others, and on stories that are being told about actors. Behavior is attributed to actors, reactions are addressed to them, or stories are being told about them. And this leads to the construction of the identity of the actor. Therefore, I speak about identities here rather than actors. This is like a persona in a theater play or a movie. We learn about her through what happens, not through answers to questions in interviews. In particular, we usually learn little about their attributes and attitudes, unless these are revealed in the course of events and the documents under consideration. In computational social science, identities of individuals become data points next to other data points. In our case, they are strings of words among strings of words. Survey research and qualitative interviews, in contrast, have the individual as the case, as the basis of the data. As Foucault argues, an author or speaker does not feature as the source of text, but as a projection point in discourse. It is one of the ideas that we associate with Foucault that constitutes his identity in relation to other identities in social theoretical discourse. And we have different kinds of identities peacefully coexisting side by side in computational social science. Individuals, collective actors, states, insofar as communication is associated with them or addresses them. But we also have bots, even concepts sometimes are treated as identities. Key question here is, do identities feature as orientation points in discourse? Is discourse organized around them? In our research, we have political parties as the key actors around which discourse is organized, and I will show you two examples later. These are not defined by attributes and attitudes, but by what they do, by their speeches in parliament, and by the reactions from others. Now to social relations. In computational social science, we do not detect them in interviews and sociometric surveys. We cannot ask the actors for their ties, cannot go to the parliamentarians from early 20th century Germany and ask them whether they were friends with other parliamentarians. Social relations are therefore not conceptualized from the point of view of the individual. They are not perceived, they are not chosen by individuals. As a result, we no longer have the problems of different perception and different notions associated with social relations that frequently plague network research. Instead, we observe social relations in communicative events between actors. These events could be citations, they could be letters, emails, retweets. Of course, this does not magically solve all problems of measuring social relations. Rather, it creates new problems that we have to deal with. One new problem is a social relation does not consist of a singular event, for example, a singular email or citation. Instead, we would identify a social relation on the basis of regularities of communication. A number of emails or telephone calls between A and B would be indicative of a social relation. But how many exactly do we need? Are 2 phone calls enough for a social tie? Or do we need 3 or 5 or 10? Social relations in these kinds of analyses are typically not dichotomous. They're not on or off, but they're gradual. For example, A and B exchange 5 emails during a month of observation, and this makes for a stronger tie than if they had only exchanged 2 emails. Also, we usually have multiple kinds of communicative events in social relations. A friendship would involve a combination of phone calls, invitations, time spent together, etc. The combination of events then characterizes the kind of relationship. Two friendships, for example, might turn out to be quite different, depending on the kinds of activities involved. In our project on the Weimar Republic, we want to know something about the relations between political parties. For this, we examine the reactions from one party to speeches from another party. Here, in this hypothetical example, we have a speaker from the Social Democrats, it's a major party from the moderate left, and her own party, the Social Democrats, react with applause, as you would expect. In contrast, the far-right German nationalists, DNVP, boo the speaker. And these kinds of reactions tell us something about how parties relate to each other in parliament and in politics generally. In the proceedings, we were able to identify 14 frequent kinds of reactions marked by particular words by the stenographers, such as applause, laughter, or objections. And we now study the relative distribution of reactions between the 8 most important political parties. In the first step, we analyze what kinds of reactions feature in which directed ties between parties. Here we conduct a principal component analysis of the relative frequencies of the 14 kinds of interruptions and reactions across the 64 party-party ties to find the kinds of interaction above the line and the ties below the line. Our first component here represents a dimension from supportive kinds of interaction on the left, such as very good or applause, to hostile reactions on the right, like laughter and objections. The analysis shows on the far right, the most hostile interaction is when the proceedings note a worded statement from somebody else as a reaction to a speech, and then the speakers respond to such a statement. The same analysis also gives us values for the hostility of interaction in the directed ties between parties, as indicated by the abbreviations below the line. The most supportive ties run from the 8 parties to themselves, on the left side, on the supportive side. This is not surprising. You are supposed to support and applaud the speakers from your own party. On the hostile end, on the right side, we find a lot of relations between parties involving the far left communists and the far right Nazis, most of them to the more moderate parties in the Weimar Republic. Here we find that the interaction between parties tells us something about the relations between them. But of course, we are treating these ties here as stable and unchanging over time. We summarize the interaction through our entire time period. However, as in much computational sciences, we do have data on events, not on stable relations. This does allow us to investigate the change of social relations over time. For example, we can divide the parliamentary interaction into 3 time periods and see how relations between parties change from one period to the next. Alternatively, we can also look at the interaction dynamics in events. Do prior events have immediate effects upon future events, such as reciprocity or transitivity? This is examined in relational event models, for example, by Carter Butts, James Kitts, and Wouter de Nooy. However, it is difficult to disentangle stable relationships, interaction dynamics, and the change of social relationships over time in practice. Overall, the timestamp data typical for computational social science and digital humanities lets us move away from network ties as stable and dichotomous towards an understanding of social relations as composed of events, as gradual, and as continuously in flux. Finally, to culture. The predominant conception of culture, for example, in the sociology of knowledge by Berger and Luckmann, looks roughly like this. Culture consists of knowledge, of beliefs, of attitudes, of values of human beings, and it is mostly shared by these human beings in a social context. In this sense, we speak of Germans having a unique culture that is different, for example, from the culture of Russians, or sociologists have a different culture from economists. In computational social science, we no longer study culture as subjectively located in individuals. Instead, we study culture and communication in widely used symbols and practices. We no longer assume culture as something behind social behavior and underlying it. Instead, culture lies in the practices themselves, in communication, in the texts that we examine. For this, we have two theoretical approaches. The first is we can follow Pierre Bourdieu and examine culture in symbolic practices. Through the usage of symbols, actors relate to each other. They show their vicinity or they distance themselves from each other. In the Weimar Republic Parliament, we can locate political parties in relation to each other by the politically salient words that they use more or less of in their speeches. Again, we build on principal component analysis to derive the dimensions underlying the relative frequencies of word usage. Here I show the relative placement of the 8 most important political parties, capital letters, on the first 2 principal components, and the relative placements of words by their factor loadings. We only look at the 40 words that are most strongly connected to the central term Volk, which translates as people or nation, and is quite central in Weimar political discourse. In this ideological space, the communists, the KPD, are placed on the far left. They are frequently using words such as class, working, and misery. On the bottom right, we find the liberal and the Catholic conservative parties. They talk about culture, unity, ideals, and peace more often than the others. The top of the ideological space belongs to the hard-right National Socialists, NSDAP. They frequently invoke the nation, its destiny, and enemies. The parties are located here by whether they use similar words or different ones, following Bourdieu. That is, their identities are determined on the basis of symbolic practices. Their attitudes and dispositions, what we usually regard as ideology, remain unknown. Now to the second approach to culture. Following Michel Foucault, we can look for shared patterns of meaning and discourse. Culture is not contested here, as in the first approach. Rather, it is shared, part of a common discourse. In a sense, the actors disappear in this approach. Foucauldian discourse follows its own rules, irrespective of who speaks or writes. Culture is no longer tied to actors, as in Bourdieu's work. What is left is discourse or communication with its underlying patterns. In this approach, we can, for example, study networks of concepts or of symbols in the body of texts. Which ones are widely used together in discourse? Which ones frequently appear together in sentences, in speeches, documents? The most common method here is the analysis of co-occurrences of terms in text, such as in topic models. Here, we are looking at the same 40 words that are most strongly linked to Volk, people, in the parliamentary proceedings of the Weimar Republic. Which ones are frequently used together? Again, the links are not on or off. We only mark the top 10% of associations by lines here, but we use the actual strengths of association of all ties in our analyses. The big question is, of course, what kinds of patterns do we expect in cultural networks? Which analyses should we conduct? Here, we use the Lugard community detection algorithm to detect groups of words that are frequently used together. We identified 5 different groups of words, 5 word communities that are indicated here in the colored spaces. and you find the labels on the bottom left of the diagram. The equivalent, of course, would be cliques in social networks or factions. And we interpret these word communities as political languages. They are either spoken by different actors in parliament in line with their ideologies. For example, the red word community is a working class vocabulary, most often used by communists and by the social democrats. Or the communities can mark different topics, such as the word community in gray, which centers on lofty ideas of morality and the soul of the people. And this is a political language spoken by a number of different parties in parliament. Alternatively, we could study structural equivalence to show that words have particular roles in relation to each other, as John Moore, for example, studied. Or we could run ergons to detect mechanisms like transitivity and preferential attachment. So that's it, pretty much. To conclude, I would argue that with the data and methods of computational social science and digital humanities, we move away from individuals to communication as the focus of our research. Our theories should follow suit to make sense of what we can observe and study. Secondly, timestamp data allows us to examine the social world, not in terms of static structures or patterns, but in terms of the processes at work. We can study the social and the cultural as it is enacted and in flux. Finally, many theorists would argue that computational social science and digital humanities are problematic because of this. They do not give us insights into what individuals are doing, and they do not present us with neat and stable social structures. Critical realists, methodological individualists, and sociologists of knowledge claim that this is not what the social world looks like. It is fundamentally populated by individuals, and we need to know about their subjective meaning. Following this line of argument, computational social science and digital humanities wouldn't get us anywhere, because they don't show us the really important stuff. I would argue that the aim of theories is not to capture things as they really are. We will never know how things really are, no matter what theorists like to tell us. Instead, we have to rely on what we can observe. Computational social science and digital humanities allow us new kinds of observations, and we need theory to make sense of these. That is what I would like to offer, but it requires a fundamental rethinking of our fundamental concepts of actors or identities, of social relations, and of culture. So thanks for holding out and looking forward to discussing these ideas.